It's good to see all of you. And it's great fun for me to get to introduce to you someone that most of us know and a great friend of GraceStLukes, Mitzi Minor. Mitzi is the Mary Magdalene Professor of New Testament at MTS, our seminary here in town. Mitzi has 3 degrees. She has a PhD, she has an MDiv, and she has a BA, a Bachelor of Arts. And I can promise you that this morning that among those 3 degrees, the one that she's thinking the most about is her BA because it came from Auburn University. Yes. Yes. She is not here to talk about football. I've made that clear, but she will. She was actually present a week, 2 weeks ago, if there's anything as such as a holy day, at Auburn University. Mitzi was present on that great miracle or whatever it was a couple of weeks ago, so she may tell a story about that. But more importantly, she is here to talk about stories in the New Testament. What we've been doing, Mitzi, for all of fall is looking at, in terms of prayer and theology in Scripture, the way in which we hear God's voice, and God seems to speak both through prayer and Scripture in different moods. God has different types of voices. And as we delve into the Scriptures, we discover all these different genres. And we feel like if we can get a better sense of what the genre is or the mood of God's voice, we have a better sense of who God is and what God is calling us to be. So she comes with that as the overarching umbrella of her topic today, which is the first in a 3-week series. And today she's going to be looking at the role of story in the New Testament. Please welcome her back warmly to GraceStLukes.
Not going to talk about football, but I'm going to smile a lot. I did wear my orange and blue. I want that observed. Miss Caroline is not here, so I could say something, but I'm very gentle with Miss Caroline. So try to be a good friend in addition to those things. Thank you for the warmth of your welcome, as you always make me feel very much a part of you, and I'm very, very grateful for that. Thank you very much. I'm using my little computer today, which is going to be interesting because I don't usually do this and frankly don't like to. But given the weather, I don't have a printer at my house anymore. I just print at the office, and I didn't go to the office the last couple of days. So we're going to see how this works. And hope the screen doesn't sort of decide to hibernate on me at a time when I won't have to go, no. But if I do that, you'll know why. Okay, it's not y'all. It's this. I always love to have an opportunity to share in church settings during the season of Advent, although sometimes I don't, because I'm also got papers to grade stacked up about yay high. Those of you who are teachers and otherwise involved in academic institutions probably know. Richard said, "How are you today?" And I said, never ask an academic at the end of a term how he or she is, because I got papers up to here. So sometimes Advent is hard for me to immerse myself into because I'm immersed in grading papers. But if I get to come and be with you, that gives me my excuse to put the papers aside and to think about something else for a while, and that's a great gift for me. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to talk today about stories, but I'm going to start by getting you to think a little bit about thinking differently. Isn't that an odd kind of way to start, right? One of the most difficult things for any of us, under any kinds of circumstances, to really wrap our minds around are circumstances when other people think differently than we do. Now, I'm not talking about people who look at an issue and this person has this perspective and this person has another one. Or here's a question, and this person answers it one way and this person answers another way. I'm not talking about that. That happens. Democrats and Republicans, for example, have fundamentally different views about how government ought to operate, but they don't think differently. They think in the same way. They just have a different perspective from which to view government, okay? I'm talking about genuinely, deeply thinking differently. And that's hard for us to wrap our minds around precisely because we think in a particular way. Now, the reason that I'm starting there, which you may be thinking, okay, that's odd. Okay, the reason I'm starting there is because the people in the Bible were from obviously, this part's obvious to you, a different time and a different place than we are from, and fundamentally they think or thought, I guess I should say that, they thought differently than we think. And so when we turn to the Bible, we have their thoughts, not ours. And that's one of our struggles with really knowing how to read and appreciate the Bible. I mean, how many of you have tried to read the Bible and you sort of, almost give up in despair? I don't get it. I can't follow along. I don't know what this means. I don't know why. I don't get it. How many of you started to read the Bible at some point in your life? You decided, I'm going to be good at this, so I'm going to read the Bible. New Year's resolution, I'm going to read the Bible straight through in a year, right? You got a whole bunch of you done that. How many of you actually made it? No, I'm not going to ask that question. Because let me tell you what happened. If you made it through the begat chapters in Genesis, and if you got through the second half of the book of Exodus, then you got to Leviticus, and you were done. Right? Okay, so if you feel guilty about that, let me alleviate that guilt. We've all been there. That's just sort of that. And the reason, or at least part of the reason for that, is because genuinely people in the ancient world thought fundamentally differently than we do. Now, I'm going to try to help us wrap our minds around that a little bit today. So let's start with an aspect of this dilemma that we know reasonably well, and that would be us. Let's start with our side of the equation. See, we live in, I suppose there are a kabillion ways we could describe our time. But for our purposes this morning, let me describe our time. We are fundamentally a modern scientific and technological culture. Okay? That's pretty general, but for our purposes that will work, right? And here's one consequence of that. In our public discourse, okay, what we say culturally and how we operate culturally is, and this is but one aspect of it, one aspect of the way we operate culturally or of our public discourse. That's so you can feel like you've had scholarly stuff today. Go out and talk to somebody about it. Have you ever thought about how our public discourse, just so you can be very impressive, okay? But that's called our public discourse, or how culturally we talk about things. We would say that truth equals verifiable facts. Okay? Now, here's how you know that that's how we think culturally. If somebody says to you, man, you got to hear this story. It is a true story. What do they mean? What do they mean by it's a true story? Yeah, it really happened. Now, they may be lying to you, but that's what they mean. So somebody says to you, oh man, you got to hear this story. This is true. This is a true story. You got to hear this. What they mean is this actually happened. And one of the reasons the story that they want to tell you they find so fascinating is precisely because it actually happened, and in some way it's odd. And so they want to tell you about it, okay? So that is one of the things that clues us in to the way we define, culturally, we define what truth is. Truth equals verifiable facts. Now, in the context, or in our cultural context then, when that's sort of our fundamental definition of truth, when we turn to the Bible, what we want to know is, what are the facts? Which facts are verifiable? What really happened? That tends to be our question. What really happened? I remember I took a course a number of years ago when I was a seminarian on resurrection, and my professor said on the first day that the goal of our course is to find out what really happened. Okay? So that's how we think, and when we turn to the Bible, we bring that with us, whether we consciously think about it or not, because culturally that's what we've been taught to do. So let me give you an example of how that works, and I'm going to use the Old Testament story of Jonah. Okay? Great children's story, right? You learned this way back when you were a kid, right? All right, now, here's the story that I learned when I was a kid growing up in church. Okay? God calls Jonah to go to Nineveh, but Nineveh was the capital city of Israel's biggest, baddest enemy. And so Jonah was afraid to go. And so rather than heading to Nineveh, Jonah headed in the opposite direction. I actually don't know if I knew that when I was a kid, but I know it now. It's where he went was the opposite direction. By boat, of course. And so he got on the boat, and then a storm comes up, and the storm seems to be like way out of the ordinary. And so the sailors are trying to figure out why this is way out of the ordinary. And Jonah says, I know why it's out of the ordinary, because God called me to do this, and I'm running, and God's doing this to me. And all the soldiers go, you put us all in danger, And so he says, okay, well, throw me overboard. So they throw him overboard. And here's where the story gets fun, right? And the whale swallows Jonah. And in the belly of the whale, Jonah repents. And so the whale vomits him, literally, by the way, the Hebrew says that, vomits him up on the land. And then he goes to Nineveh and preaches, and Nineveh repented, and everybody lived happily ever after. Okay? Now, is that the story you all heard kind of when you grew up? Okay, that's the story I heard growing up. Okay? And then what's happened in Christianity, once we became a scientific culture, then the debate about Jonah has been whether or not it was possible for a human being to be swallowed by a whale, stay alive, and get vomited up on the shore and actually, be alive, assuming you would want to be under those circumstances, right? Okay. And that's been the major debate. Can a man be swallowed by a whale and live? And if you know anything about, how Christians have talked about it, that debate has raged far and wide, and there have been people who've said, yes, here's a scientific, thing that says it can happen, and then everybody else is over here going, no, you're like kidding, right? Yeah, that cannot happen, okay? So that's what we do with something like the book of Jonah in our scientific culture, and when we define truth as being about scientific facts. All right, now, ancient people, the people who give us the biblical stories, were not scientific like we are. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't think or ask questions, but it means that the scientific method did not shape their lives. Now, that doesn't mean, again, this is a piece that's hard. It doesn't mean that they sort of examined the scientific method and thought, no, I really don't want to go that route. It's not that. The scientific method hadn't been invented yet. Nobody had conceived of the idea that truth equals empirical data and verifying the facts of something else. That is fundamentally not how they thought about truth. For them, truth was what made sense out of life. If something helps me make sense out of life, then that is true. Okay? So, let's go back to Jonah, then, for example. Okay? I was in seminary before I learned that there is a chapter 4 in Jonah. After Jonah goes to Nineveh and preaches and they repent, then Jonah goes out by himself and pouts. Did y'all know this part of the story? I didn't know this part of the story. Okay? Jonah, okay, y'all are like all shaking your heads like, no, you didn't know. Okay, so aren't you glad I'm here? Already. Okay? Already, you know something you didn't know. Jonah goes out and pouts. You would think he's been like a mega successful preacher, so now we're going to have a mega church in Nineveh. Hey, hello. Okay, and so he would be like, okay, let's start passing the offering plate and stuff. Let's get this thing going. No, he leaves and goes out here by himself and pouts. And God comes and speaks to Jonah and says, essentially, why are you pouting? And Jonah says to God, isn't this what I knew would happen? Didn't I know that you were a God who is slow to anger, gracious and merciful, and abounding in steadfast love? Didn't I know that you would forgive those cotton-picking Ninevites? And now we find out that Jonah did not run from God's call because Jonah was afraid to go to Nineveh. He didn't want God to forgive Nineveh. They were the enemy. He wanted God to crush Nineveh. And he was irritated that God wanted to bless Nineveh and forgive them and save them. And so when it happened, he's just as mad as he can be. And so he goes out here and pouts. And so for the ancient people, the story of Jonah is incredibly true because it is hard to love our enemies. And when we say that God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, we really want that to be true for us. Not for them, whoever them may be. But if we say that about God, that has implications for all of creation. If we say that God created all that exists, if we say, for God so loves the world, if we say that God is gracious and merciful, that has enormous implications for how we live and how we think about people that we label as enemies. And the truth of the story is right there for ancient people. This is hard, but it is also what God has called us to do and be. So we turn to the book of Jonah and we ask, can a person really survive if they're swallowed by a whale and get vomited up on a shore and then go preach? And if we ask that of ancient people, they would look at us and say, why do you care? You've missed the whole point. And they're right. It's just like me not even knowing chapter 4 existed. And some of y'all didn't know it existed either because you were like saying that, okay? And that is the whole point of the story. It's spiritual and theological challenge. And that challenge, ancient people would say, is true. And if we come along and say, can you verify that? They would look at us like we have lost our ever-loving minds. Okay? So do you see what I mean when I say fundamentally we think differently? Okay? All right. Now with that, let me tell you this. A friend of mine, one of my colleagues at the seminary used to say, okay, I said all of that to say this. Okay? All right. Now we come to the topic of the day. Aren't you glad? One of the significant ways that you communicate that kind of truth. Truth is what makes sense out of life. Truth is what helps me understand life. Truth helps me understand why I feel like Jonah some days. Okay? And if that's what truth is, then one of the most significant ways to convey that kind of truth is through a story. Think for a minute how much of what we know about God we know because of the stories in the Bible. Whether we're talking about Noah and a flood, or Moses in a burning bush, or the Exodus through the Red Sea, Daniel in a lion's den, and then the New Testament stories, Jesus feeding 5,000. How much of what we know about God we know through the stories of the Bible? One of the things I think we do, or at least let me say again, in my experience in church, one of the things that we did badly in my growing up, you know, when I was a kid in Sunday school, I loved Sunday school. You know, we drew the pictures, we acted the stories out. Sometimes we got to dress up, you know, and act the stories out. We'd crawl on the floor and use building blocks and build things. We'd have like stuffed lions and act out Daniel in the lion's den. You know, and I loved it. I just loved it. And then I graduated from elementary school into junior high school, back when they called it that, and I went into the youth Sunday school, and now we sat around a table and discussed theology. And I remember as a kid thinking, what happened? Because in our, again, scientific technological culture, where truth equals data and verifiable facts, then we think once you start to grow up, then we've got to give you the facts. And we take a step away from the stories. All right, let me ask you this. If I put a theology book here and a story book here, which one are you going to read? If you have to read both of them, which one are you likely to read twice? All right? I mean, seriously. So But that's because in our culture, where we define truth equals facts or data, that's what we do. But the stories that have come down to us, how many of you are still shaped in your own faith development because when you were a child, somebody told you about Moses in a burning bush? I loved all that. How many of you did y'all have like Bible stories for children thing? My dad used to read to me a lot every night, you know? And that's why I learned this. Joseph in that many-colored coat. Really? That was a cool story, right? Okay. But then we don't stop doing that. Let's take a moment and talk about why those stories still speak to us, because here's the funky thing for me. I mentioned a minute ago our public discourse, right? Okay? Our public discourse says that truth equals verifiable facts. One of the things that I encourage you to observe, not just about this topic, but about many topics, is we have our public discourse, or what our culture teaches us, and we sort of rock along. Culturally, we sort of go along with it. And then there's real life, right? So culturally, we're taught this, and then we live our lives here, but because culturally this is what we talk about, many times we're not even observing that in real life we're doing something else entirely. Culturally, we learn that truth equals verifiable facts. In real life, we all love a story. And we tell stories. Here's an example. Maybe last week during Thanksgiving, if you gathered with your family or your friends, or maybe coming up during the Christmas season, you gather with family and friends, how long does it take before somebody says, y'all remember when? Because Southerners tell stories like that. Ancient people said once upon a time. Southerners say, y'all remember when, all right? Okay. All right, so somebody says, y'all remember when, and then you start telling a story about some other time when y'all were together. Okay, y'all do that, or is that just my family? Are we weird? Okay, we are weird, but maybe not in that way, right? Okay, so suppose that happens. Okay, somebody says, y'all remember that Friday night that we were all over at, Aunt Edna's, or I should say my Aunt Patsy. I have two Aunt Patsys, so I'll do Aunt Patsy, okay? So y'all remember that Friday night that we were all over at Aunt Patsy's, and one of your cousins or one of your in-laws says, that wasn't a Friday night, that was a Saturday night. Aha, you've all got one, don't you? And then you say, okay, well, it was a Saturday night, we were all out on the deck, and that same cousin says, we weren't out on the deck because it was raining. And you say, okay, so it was a Saturday night, we were in the den, and we were eating the hamburgers we just grilled, and that cousin says, I just told you it was raining. We didn't grill hamburgers that night. Patsy made soup. At this point, you about had it, right? And so you turn to that cousin and say, are you going to let me tell this story or what? Because even we scientific people know that the facts of that story are pretty much irrelevant. It's the story that matters. Something happened, some moment happened in and with and among these people whom you love and who love each other, and that moment sort of defines something important about this group. My family, I was in Auburn for the Auburn-Alabama game. I was in the stadium, and for years, in fact, I've already was telling folks sitting to breakfast with me about sitting next to my sister at that game who did not watch the play because she was afraid the field goal was going to be good. And so she did not watch the play. And so she did not, way after it was over, she grabbed my arm and said, how did Chris Davis get the ball? Way after we'd celebrated, okay? So for years, my family will tell stories about, what we were doing and who was doing what and stuff, because that tells us something about us. You have family stories like that too. And whether it was Friday night or Saturday night, whether you were on the deck or in the den, whether you ate burgers or soup, who cares? It's the story that matters. And even we scientific people know that. Let's take a moment then and talk about what it is that stories do for us. Stories matter, and they always have mattered. They've mattered to people in all cultures, in all times, and all places. Ursula Le Guin, who is a novelist in our time, once said, there have been cultures of people who didn't use the wheel. There have been no cultures that did not tell stories. Stories matter matter to us because they tell us something about who we are and where we come from and where we're going. They tell us what matters most deeply to us. And they tell us these things because some stories, touch us at an incredibly deep level within us. Some stories we tell simply because they're funny. Some stories we tell because they teach lessons. Anybody in here didn't read the story about the little boy who cried wolf to your kids? I mean, we use the phrase, don't cry wolf, and it comes from a children's story. Okay? Some of the stories teach us things, but some stories we tell and retell and retell and retell because those stories touch us at an incredibly deep place. This is who we are. This is what we long for most deeply. This is where we're headed. These are the pitfalls along the way. Stories will absolutely point out the ragged edges of your life. And here are stories that tell us how to pick ourselves up once we fall into one of those pits, because we will. And we tell those stories because when we hear one of those stories, we experience it as, yes, my life is like that. That story connects with our story. In fact, here's the reality. We experience our lives as a story. It's unfolding. How many of you said, well, I closed that chapter of my life and opened a new one? I mean, think about how we use that kind of language. Okay? My dad used to like to say, ooh, and now the plot thickens, when something has happened, good or bad, but now the plot thickens, okay? We experience our lives as stories, and so when we hear a story that connects with our living, what we go is, yes, life is like that. My life is like that. And so stories like that get told and retold and retold. So our forebears, who actually understood this better than we do, didn't tell stories because they actually happened. If you could talk to one of them and they said, I'm going to tell you a true story, it did not mean it actually happened. Though it may have. What it means is, here's something true to life. And so they want to pass that on to you. Here's the fun part. Every year, at this season of the year, we tell some beloved stories. We tell a story about an angel visiting a peasant girl in the outback of the first century Roman Empire. And the angel says to that young girl, "Hail, favored one, the Lord is with you." Who knew Gabriel was an Episcopalian? You can all feel affirmed today. We tell a story of a virgin who conceived and bore a son. And that son was holy. His name was Jesus, and we refer to him as Emmanuel, which means that God is with us. We tell a story of Roman taxes and how Rome's system of taxation led a poor peasant, a pregnant couple, how's that for an alliteration, by the way, to travel to Bethlehem, to a stable and a manger and swaddling clothes. We tell a story of shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flocks by night. And suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared unto them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were what? Which has got to be like really afraid, right? I mean, didn't you love that when you were a kid? And they were sore afraid. Man, when I was a kid, I was thinking, that is really scary, right? That's great. They were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, "Fear not. For behold, I bring you good tidings of which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is. And this shall be a sign unto you. You shall find the babe wrapped in and lying in a..." Did you know you could do that? you can finish those sentences because you've been telling and hearing and retelling and rehearing that story all of your lives. And there's I'm sorry, that particular story, you really have to tell in King James language, don't you? I mean, have you read the newer ones? She wrapped him in bands of cloth. That just doesn't get it, does it? I mean, I'm sorry, that's really awful. We tell it and we retell it and we imagine it, and we have those shepherds out on hillsides in the dark. And we imagine the stable, and maybe the stable in your imagination looks like the one that you maybe have set out this week, you know, on your mantle or on your table, or maybe you set them in several places because you've got many of them. And that set of figures and neat-looking stable, which it wasn't, but the neat-looking stable is, I mean, what do you feel when you put that out? Because it evokes the story, and the story mattered. We tell those stories year after year after year, whether or not the facts will ever be verifiable. We tell them because those stories touch a deep place within us, a deep place in our hearts and souls. Here's the truth, friends. We want God to be one who notices peasant girls in the outback of the Roman Empire. We want God to be one who gives shepherds on a hillside in the darkness a shining moment. We want God to know about stables and mangers and the difficult places that life sometimes takes us. We want God to come to us as a baby, because babies call forth from us what? Tenderness, compassion, attention, care, sacrifice, and love. And somehow we know that when we are thus, we are our best selves. We want God to be with us. The truth is, we want the God of the Christmas story to be true. And that has nothing to do with empirical data or verifiable facts. We want the Christmas story to be true. And so we tell it and retell it and retell it. Generations of believers, the ones who came before us, have told those Christmas stories and passed it on and passed them on and passed them on until they have come all the way down to us. They told them and retold them because those stories touched within them something deep, and they found themselves saying, yes, yes, that is God as I experience God, and that is life as I experience life. Yes, that's it. And now we tell and retell those stories. So, I've got some good news for you today. Some of you are likely skeptics. And all of your life, you've had real trouble believing that a virgin could conceive and bear a son. You've had real trouble believing that angels talk to peasant girls or to shepherds, or that God talks to Joseph in a dream, or that whole stable thing just seemed a little too cutesy to be true. And you have doubted the verifiability of those facts and thought of yourself as a skeptic, and just maybe, precisely because of all of that, you felt guilty because Christians ought not doubt. I am here to alleviate you of that guilt. Go ahead and be a skeptic about the verifiable facts, if that's who you are. Because the verifiability of the facts has nothing to do with the truth of the story that the ancients passed on to us. It is the story that matters, because the story teaches us something wonderfully true about God and life and faith. So you don't have to choose, in other words, between your focus on verifiability as a product of a scientific culture and what it means to love and appreciate the stories. Sometimes my students, this is a moment that I have with my students at the seminary, and most of my students actually fall into a second category of folk. So let me tell that, and then I'll come back to my students. There's a second. Some of you, rather than being skeptics, may have always wondered if you were being too simple or too naive because you didn't question the verifiability of those facts. And then you thought maybe you were not thinking, and maybe, does Christianity ask me not to think? And maybe you've not known quite how to deal with that. I'm here to alleviate you of that one too. If you don't want to question the facts, that's okay. It is the story that matters. So, back to my students. Students at seminary are, because they are going to be ministers, tend to be, let's see, shall we say, a little zealous at times about the things that they believe. And sometimes they come up to me and ask me, Dr. Minor, because in that role that's who I have to be, so Dr. Minor, do you think those things actually happened? And here's my answer. I have no idea. And that's the truth. And the reason I have no idea is because the ancient people were not interested in telling me about the verifiable facts. They were not writing a biography of Jesus. They were not writing newspaper accounts of a night in the history of the Roman Empire. They simply were not doing that, and so they don't pass that data on to us. So when my students say to me, do you think that really happened? My honest answer is, I have no idea. And I don't care. And that's, of course, the one that messes them up. And I'm not saying that. Honestly, I hope it did happen. I hope if we had a chance that we could verify, because wouldn't that be like way cool? Because that would mess up all the scientists, And I love to mess up the folks who think they've got everything figured out, right? Confession, I get a kick out of that. I hope it happened. But it is the story and the power of the story that matters. So tell the story, friend. Tell them, cherish them, let them into your hearts yet again. This is a story that people have told and retold and retold because it touches something way deep within us human beings. God is with us. God has come to us as a baby, which means, by the way, that God trusts us to bring forth our care, our love, our compassion, our service, our attention. God trusts us to be our best selves. And then God goes out and invites people to share in the story. Shepherds and wise guys and Mary and Joseph and Anna and Simeon and all those folks who are part of the story along the way. Ancient people thought differently than we do. And because they did, they passed on these incredible stories. And we scientific types, and by the way, I don't want to knock science, okay? I don't. I have a niece who on December 20th will finish 2.5 years of treatment to beat leukemia. Ask me how much I love scientists. So I'm not knocking science. But what I am saying is that there is truth that is about verifiable facts. That's just not the only truth. And even we scientific types know that in real life. The stories that we tell matter. So cherish the story. Be scientists if that's who you are. Be scientists. Be skeptics if that's who you are. And Cherish the stories. God is with us. Shepherds were keeping watch over their flock by night, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid. And they ended up, before the night was over, singing for joy. That is a story worth cherishing. So cherish it. Get your manger scenes out, your nativity sets out. Remember the story. Let it into your souls. And say thanks be to God. Amen.